right, I think we're all set. All right, you've spent the last 5 lessons, right? Learning about the FAA, and then more importantly, the last couple of classes have put a lot of emphasis on the airplane systems, the airplane controls, the airplane engine. We're going to continue down that rabbit hole this evening. Right, we're going to talk about primarily fuel, oil, and propellers. Okay, fuel and oil do the same thing in an airplane that they do in your car. Right, we have to understand the systems. Propellers, why do they work? How do they work? You learned a little bit about propellers in the last couple of classes. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of that. I will warn you, I don't recall how long the other presentations are. There's like 120 slides in the deck today. That's do the math, right? That's 1 slide every minute. Not going to happen. Jacqueline knows this, right? So I don't tend to read slides. I teach the material, then go through the slides and say, yeah, we covered that, we covered that, we covered that, we covered that. I'd rather present the material than read from a slide. So if I get too fast or get ahead of you, please stop me. Don't hesitate to stop me and slow me down. Okay. We're going to talk about those things tonight. Some of the slides I'm going to probably intentionally either not cover at all or cover very quickly. And the reason I say that is some of the information that's in some of these presentations doesn't necessarily apply to a primary student who's working on a private pilot certificate, because it's dealing with airplane components and airplane systems on a more complex airplane, right? So you've probably seen some of that in the last couple of classes. I like to keep it more focused on what are you going to see? Where do you need to focus your knowledge and your expectations when you get into an airplane? Okay, so some of the things primarily when we get towards the end and talk about propellers, I'll go through it pretty quickly and say, look at it at home. I don't want to not teach it, but if you, I'd rather spend time on the other pertinent topics in that 2 hours that we've got. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. Again, if I go too fast, just stop me. We're going to talk about fuel. We're going to talk about a title slide for a while. Now, okay. Why do we have fuel? Somebody tell me why we have fuel. So you get combustion, right? You got to have fuel. In an airplane, we have two types of fuel systems. Now, think about an airplane versus a car, or an SUV, or a four-wheel drive pickup, right, or a Jeep, right? You're pretty stable attitude in a car, right? Think about an airplane. You want to be really cool. You're banking hard. You're going upside down, right? You got to think about the fuel systems need to operate a little bit differently in an airplane than they do in a car. That airplane's fuel system needs to be able to accommodate those various changes in attitude. The last thing you want to do is be banked hard to the left or the right, and you don't have any fuel in the tank that's at the upwind side, right? So we need to make sure that the aircraft systems facilitate those kind of attitude changes. We have two kind of fuel systems. We'll talk about both gravity fed and fuel pump systems. Okay. Gravity feed. What's a gravity fed system? Somebody take a shot. Yeah, because of what? Gravity. The fuel tanks are high, the engine's low. Gravity does its job. For that same gravity fuel system, what happens if you invert? It don't work. Okay. So typically, what are we going to have in a gravity fed system to facilitate those times when gravity ain't doing its job? A pump. Exactly. Okay. So even though we call it a gravity fed system, you're going to see that a gravity fed system, just like we have on the Cessna aircraft downstairs, they all have an auxiliary fuel pump, an auxiliary electrical driven fuel pump that you put on during the flight. Okay. This is what it would look like. Very simple diagram. Fuel tanks are in the wings, comes down through a selector valve. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Goes through these various strainers to make sure we're not getting sediment, water into the engine, and feeds right into the engine's carburetor or injection system. Okay. Here's the engine-driven pump that we're talking about. That's not going to be used all the time. Okay. Oh no, this is the low wing. I'm sorry, we're already in the low wing. Did I go too fast there? Oh, there it is. Okay, here we go. Okay. Low wing. What's the problem now with low wing? We don't have the benefit of gravity, right? We have to have something pumping that fuel from the tanks upwards into the fuel system or into the engine. Okay. Typically, these aircraft are going to have a fuel system that has two pumps. Why do we have two? Redundancy, right? Exactly. If something happens to that engine-driven fuel pump, from the time you hit the magnetos, you crank on the engine, that engine-driven fuel pump is what's driving that fuel flow. Okay. If something happens to that engine-driven pump, hopefully it's not the engine going bad, but if something happens to that engine-driven fuel pump, you've got an electric auxiliary fuel pump to turn on and also facilitate pumping of that fuel into the engine. Okay. Any questions? All good stuff? All right. All right, the top line there talks about recommended actions for activating the auxiliary fuel pump. There's different phases of flight. What happens if you are in a takeoff or landing phase? What happens if you're on short final to the runway and that engine-driven fuel pump dies on you? If you don't have the electric on, what's going to happen? You may end up running short, coming in short of that runway. On takeoff, if you are running down the runway and the engine-driven fuel pump shuts off, you're dead on the runway. So there are different times, we call them critical phases of flight. There's different phases of flight, takeoffs, landings, doing maneuvers, okay, any kind of serious maneuvers. The recommendation from the manufacturer is normally turn on the auxiliary pump. So it's going to be there in case something happens during that phase of flight. Okay. So during particular phases of flight, the manufacturer will recommend that you turn on the auxiliary pump instead, or in addition to the engine-driven pump. Okay. Just throughout these slides, I don't think you had these in last year. Through a lot of these slides, it's going to show you what and it takes these pictures right from the airplanes we have here. A lot of what they would look like. Some of the fuel gauges, pressure gauges. Okay, just like you would see in a car on a either a digital or analog system. Here, what he's showing is that electric pump, always just a switch. I love we probably could have picked a better airplane. That doesn't instill a lot of confidence in the aircraft fleet, but they are all solid aircraft. Let me promise you that. But those auxiliary pumps are just a switch. Electrically. Okay. Low wing, just the opposite of the gravity fed. Okay. We picked out two pictures here. One directly from the Cessna 172s that we have on the line, and the Viper Warriors that we have on the line. That's what you would see if you pick up the manufacturer's pilot handbook. That's the diagram you're going to see. Okay. Fuel tanks. Where are they? In the wings, right? Okay, they're in the wings. They have a vent and they have overflow drains, right? What happens to fuel when it gets hot? It expands, right? If you've got full tanks in your airplane and you're sitting out on the ramp in 100-degree weather, what's going to happen to that fuel? If you don't have vents or drains for that fuel or that vapor to escape from, what's going to happen? It's gonna blow, right? Something's gonna happen. Something's gonna go horribly wrong with that fuel tank. So they're designed so that as that expansion happens, there's vents to allow the gases to vent, and you'll see. I think he's got a picture here. Yeah. Underneath the wing, there's drains, right? So if there's overflow, that fuel gets to a point at the top of the tank where it will actually drain out to relieve that pressure. Make sure you're not exceeding the pressures in the tank. Get back here. Okay. Make sense? Okay. So we want to make sure we've got the fuel, make sure it doesn't get too much pressure in the tanks. The vents, what happens if we've got a closed system and the engine is sucking fuel from the tanks, right, to run the engine? What's happening in that tank? As the gas goes away, you get a vacuum, right? So what makes sense? You need to have a way to vent to allow air to replace that space, take up that volume in the tank as that fuel being consumed, right? So we want to make sure those vents are open, because if those vents are open, we continue to cause a vacuum in that tank. What's eventually going to happen as you're at 5,000 feet in the air? You're going to find the engine's not getting any fuel, right? You're going to get starvation. Okay, so when you're doing your pre-flight, ladies, when you're doing your pre-flight, always make sure your drains and your vents are open, clear. Okay. Right, this is stuff we just talked about. Okay. The primer he's talking about here. Again, the primer, we don't see them in cars anymore. Way back in the day we did. But the primer just is a way to prime fuel and vaporize it to get into the injection system or into the carburetors to make sure that it's ready to go when you take that magneto and turn on the starter switch. Okay. You want to make sure that that primer is locked, because if it's not locked and it becomes loose, it could allow excess fuel to be pumped into the system. Okay. Every plane that we have here on the line has a primer. No, I take that back. The Warriors have a primer, the 172s do not. So you need to make sure that after you prime the system at start, make sure that thing's locked. Okay. I always find this interesting. And I think that there are different interpretations, but the rules for the FAA's rules for aircraft fuel indicators is that it's got to be accurate at 2 points: when you're full and when you're empty. Okay. So that's a pretty wide gap in there, right? So it's really important that when you're doing your pre-flight, you're not only looking at those gauges to see, hey, it's telling me I've got 3/4 of a tank on the left and I got a half a tank on the right, right? It's really important to verify during a pre-flight, looking at the tank, looking inside to validate what you're seeing inside the airplane. Okay, don't ever just randomly trust. Don't just trust the fuel gauges. Okay. Okay. Here again, same pictures. We see the fuel pressure, fuel gauges, give me the same thing. Interestingly enough, when our Cessna 172s that are down here, this is their display for fuel quantity. When those tanks are full, that's exactly what it looks like. Does that look like it's reading correctly at full? Okay, so that's why it's so important. Don't just trust the gauges, verify. Okay, trust but verify. All right, this is showing very quickly how the fuel is monitored and the senders that send the information from the tank to those gauges. It's basically a float, right? There's a system inside the tank that's got a float that's going up and down, sending a signal back out to the fuel gauge saying, hey, I'm full, I'm empty, right? So again, it's the calibration in this system that's saying, is it accurate or is it not accurate? Okay. You get to the point where you're not seeing any kind of indication at all, it's time to have your mechanic replace that. And
for the fuel, like in this diagram, where would the vent be?
Vents are normally in the top. Okay, that's what Nicholas was trying to show. I blew that picture pretty quickly. Right, they're going to be in the top of the Phillip caps. The vents are around there. Okay, and then the drains are here. That's where the overflow is going to be. Okay, answer the question. Okay. All right, fuel selectors. Again, we've got fuel in 2 wingtips, right? I should say wingtips. We got fuel in 2 wing tanks. Okay. You have the ability to select which tank you want to pull the fuel from. Okay. You can have left, I want to use the left tank, I want to use the right tank, I want to use both, or not optimal when you're flying, none. You know, you don't want to set it for off or none, okay? But you're using that for balance, right? And depending on it depends on the airplane's design, the systems on the airplane. You will see here. The one on the left is a Cessna 172, the one on the right is one of our Piper Warriors. On the left, you've got left, right, and both, and there's no off, right? There's a pull, a handle to pull to turn the fuel off. When that's in, it's on, you're good, but you're always on left tank, right tank, or both tanks. Okay, this is a 172. Where's our tanks here? Up high, so there's a gravity fed system, right? You're going to, in flight, you're gonna be set to both, right? You're gonna let gravity do its deal, and you're not gonna pick one tank. The system's gonna take fuel from both sides, you're gonna maintain that weight balance within the aircraft by just setting it to both. Typically, you're gonna set it to left or right when you're on the ground, okay? If you're on the ground and the plane's not quite level, what's the fuel gonna do if it's just sitting there unlevel? If you've got it set to both, what can happen there? It can, well, it won't take from one side, but if you're sitting on the ground, gravity will take it from the higher wing tank and feed that fuel down to the lower tank. Right? Again, it's gravity doing its deal. So when we're flying, we have it set to both. So we've always got a constant feed from both sides into the engine. When we're on the ground, we set it for either the left or the right-hand side to prevent the fuel from going from one side to the other. Okay, so you're maintaining your balance. Okay.
So
Right? Yes, sir.
the tanks cross field, they don't independently go to the carburetor?
Say it again.
Do the tanks cross field each other?
They do. They cross feed. That when you're on both, that's exactly what's happening. They cross feed. So
And both, it could be independent going.
that's right. Right. So on the right side, you've got the Warrior, where you've got a left fuel tank, a right fuel tank, or off. Right. The gravity fed or the fuel pump system, you've got to set to the left tank or the right tank. There is no dual feed in these aircraft, right? So you're picking, do I want to feed the engine from the left tank or the right tank? And what do you think you have to do if you're on a long flight? Back and forth, right? So how would we do that? How often? How long? Okay,
5 gallons,
huh?
5 gallons, less than 5 gallons.
If you know your airplane and how much you're burning, there's no right answer, right? A lot of manufacturers will say, run the first tank for 15 minutes or 30 minutes, switch to the other side for an hour, then switch back to the other side for an hour, right? But you're constantly switching from left to right and back to left to make sure you're maintaining that balance and not doing an entire 3-hour flight with one tank.
So why not fly on both to have them evenly pulled?
With a low wing airplane, in this case, there is no both.
Gotcha.
It's only, you're either pulling from the left or from the right. Okay? Make sense? Yeah.
If you're doing a lot of maneuvers and I know a lot of times you turn left, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Does that affect the gas? Like, or is it going to kind of would it return to the right wing if you're doing a lot of left turn maneuvers?
In which airplane?
That's Skyhawk.
The Skyhawk, yeah, the Skyhawk, if you're on both.
Yeah.
You're gonna expect it's gonna balance out, but it's not guaranteed, right? If you're doing a lot of, well, any good pilot should be doing turns to the left and to the right. Right? Practice both sides. But if you're doing a lot of pattern work and you're constantly turning to the left, that could become a problem, right? But yeah, the gravity feed should allow for enough cross feed. But again, what are you gonna do? You're gonna monitor your fuel gauges. If for some reason the left tank or the right tank is empty, is it a problem? Not necessarily. That's the benefit of the high wing, right, and the gravity fed. They're both feeding. So unless you're in some really, really funky attitude where that fuel can't get to the engine from the high, either one of those high wing tanks, you're in pretty good shape. Yes, sir.
So why can't the low wing pull from both tanks?
They're just not manufactured that way.
Because of, I mean, literally, it's the same thing if you're running the booster pump on the highway.
That's correct. Yeah, there's nothing that says they can't. They just don't manufacture them that way.
I just want to make
I
you do
can't
more
answer
work.
that question.
Okay.
The positioning for the switch.
I'm sorry?
The positioning for the switch.
Huh?
One's near the foot and one's in the center console. Does that change, like, how easy it is to switch between?
Well, depends on who you are and how you are. If you're an old guy like me, sometimes it's a little hard to reach down there and get to that puppy, right? But no, it's right at your knee, right? If you're sitting there in the cockpit, you're in the left-hand seat. It's literally right at your left-hand knee to reach down there and switch it over. Okay. There's more of a risk in doing what if you're doing that? If you're reaching down to switch the fuel tank,
Hitting a rudder, hitting a control.
anything, yeah, losing your attitude.
Pulling a job.
Not paying attention to what you're doing. Next thing you know, you're in a left turning dive.
That's what happened to John Denver in Monterey.
Yeah.
His fuel selector was in the back.
That's good design. So that's the more important thing, right? So the other thing too is when you're in this airplane, and this is probably, I don't say probably, this is all in slides, and we're gonna go blow right through here. We're talking through all the stuff. When you're in that low wing airplane, right? It's the fuel pump, right? It's pushing that fuel. Okay. One thing that we also want to do when we switch from left tank to right tank or vice versa, you want to always turn on that auxiliary boost pump, right? To make sure you've got fuel pressure, right? Say, it's all memorization. It's all just muscle memory, right? Before you do it, flip on the boost pump, look at the fuel pressure gauge. Fuel pressure is good. Flip the tank. Look at the fuel pressure gauge. Is it still good? Turn off the boost pump. Look at the pressure gauge. Are we still getting good pressure from the engine driven fuel pump, right? Constantly looking at that fuel pressure gauge to make sure that that engine driven pump's doing its job. Okay. Questions? All right. Yeah, see, I'm good. I'm getting through all this stuff. Okay, let's talk about the fuel itself now. The most common contaminant in an engine system or in a fuel system is water. Why do we think that is? It's what?
It's
What part of the air? Well, yeah, there you go, condensate. Speak up. Okay, it's okay to be loud. I am. Condensation, right? So when you don't have full fuel tanks, what's taking up the room, the volume in that tank that's not being taken up by fuel? Air. What tends to happen to air when it gets hotter and colder? You get condensation. Condensation in the fuel tank becomes bad. Okay. Couple of ways we try to avoid that. Fill your tanks at the end of every day. Don't let the tanks sit empty in the hangar or outside the hangar overnight. Because you're just giving yourself more chance of having that condensation water in the tanks. Fill it, make sure you're looking, right? When you test the fuel, always test the fuel. Okay. I'm probably gonna, yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay.
Do they have a water separator?
Not a water separator, they have strainers, okay, which will hopefully bring it out. Let's get to the diagrams here. Okay, it goes through a strainer. The strainers remove sediment, may remove water, depending on the system. The type of strainer that you have can collect, the water can collect at the bottom of the strainer and not get into the fuel, into the engine. Okay. But we've got a couple of different things on the plane. This is I like this diagram. It's got everything in a very simple view. You get the tank in the airplane. Wings are typically just a little bit of an angle, right? Not necessarily flat. So you've always got towards the inboard part of the tank, right by the fuselage, you've got a low point, right? If you have sediment, if you have water, where's it gonna collect? At the low point, right? It's all gonna be heavier, water's heavier than the fuel, it's gonna sink, the sediment's gonna sink, it's gonna be captured here. Anything that gets out of the tank and comes into the fuel system on its way into the engine, right, is going through. We're calling it a gascolator, but it's another strainer down here. And there's a better picture of what that may look like in a couple of slides. But that strainer is another second line of defense to make sure you're catching sediment and water before it goes to that final step into the carburetor or the fuel injectors. Okay, so you see that low spot. If you've got water and sediment there, you got a little drain here, okay? You're gonna drain the fuel from the tanks before every flight. You're gonna take a sample and you're gonna hold it up and say, yep, looks clear, looks blue. I don't see any water sinking it. I don't see any floaties in there, right? There's no nasties. You know, you're good. If you happen to see water or sediment, when you drain that tank, you take a sample, throw it away in an environmentally friendly way. Take another sample. If there's still water or sediment, take another sample. Okay, you get to the point where it's clean, you're good. If you get to the point where you say, I'm not flying this airplane because I can't get rid of the water and the sediment, good idea to scratch it for that day, call the mechanic. Okay, get them to look at it and drain the tanks and get them cleaned out. Okay. What happens if we get water or sediment into the fuel system and into the engine? Shut down. It's gonna shut down. That's gonna lead to disastrous results. Okay. Right, here's that gascolator. This is what we're looking at there, right? So the fuel comes in, goes down to the bottom. Anything that's heavy is gonna settle down here and hopefully not make it back up through here into the engine. Okay. So again, second line of defense on making sure. You see a drain down there as well, right? On a Cessna 172, you flying 172? Visa? How many drains are there? How many things you have to drain fuel out of? Hmm?
No, I'm not on that. Cessna, so, I'm draining too.
Oh, you're on a Piper. Anybody fly 172?
13.
Okay,
13.
where are they?
5 on each wing and 3 under the
There you go. Yep. 13 different drains that you have to test to make sure that the fuel is clear on a 172.
And you tested just like you took the Piper.
Okay.
You tested just like you took the.
Every
They
time
did
you fly.
5 different ones
Yep.
each way.
You pull a sample from every single of the
And why
13
do
drains. What's that?
Why do we have so many?
I can't
I'm sorry.
answer. The 3 in the bottom make more sense, right? Because they're going through the final strainer and the sumps and everything. 5 in the tank itself, I don't know. Okay.
Is it because?
Maybe they created a tank with 5 low points. I don't know.
Bigger?
No,
My guess is that the angle of the wing isn't as steep as compared to a low wing.
yeah, I don't know because what is it? 3 and 2? I think there's 2 closest to the fuselage and 3 a little bit outboard. Right, so it's not even like they're all the way out through the tank. It's 2 and 3 in parallel. So yeah. I'm not the design engineer. I can't tell you why, but I would say test it. Okay, there's what they look like. Cessna 172. There's the drainer, and that's a Piper. Again, that's a nasty looking wing. That's the other side of the wing. Somebody either drove through a massive mud puddle or that. Okay, so this is all the stuff we already talked about. You get water in the lines, it can freeze, it can cause condensation, all bad stuff, whether it's ice chipping off and going into the fuel system, or water or sediment, all bad, right? So the whole idea is to make sure that you as a pilot are doing your due diligence, do your pre-flight, make sure that fuel is good before you start the engine. Okay. Fuel grade. Everybody have gas? Have heard that term? Okay. Aviation gas, plane gas, gasoline. There are different grades, just like there's different grades of fuel for cars. 87 octane, 89, 91, 93. Airplanes, there are different grades of fuel for aircraft. Okay. Higher grades withstand more pressure without detonation. We'll talk about a little bit about detonation in a couple of slides, a little bit further down. And lower grades for lower compression engines, they ignite at lower temperatures, right? Some planes are going to burn hotter, some are going to burn cooler. You want to make sure you have the right grade of fuel for the engine type for your aircraft, right? So your manufacturer documentation is going to tell you what to use. Use it. Don't try to save money by going to a lower octane fuel or a lower level fuel. It's not gonna pay well in the end. Okay. If the proper grade isn't available, use the next higher grade as a substitute, right? Don't downgrade. If you downgrade, then you risk your aircraft is going to be burning too hot for that lower level fuel, right? So it's always better to go up a level. Avgas 80, 100, and 100 LL. LL stands for low lead. Okay. Only 100 LL is available today. Right? Anywhere you go is what you're going to see is 100 LL. Jet fuel, you're going to smell it. You'll love to smell of jet fuel in the morning, but you're not going to see that in the aircraft you're going to be flying. Okay. How do we know we're getting the right kind of fuel? Color. Okay. We said 80, 100, and 100 LL is what's for general aviation, normal general aviation aircraft. These two are not around anymore, so it's all blue. So when you take that sample from all 13 of those strainers or drains on the Cessna 172, you're going to hold it up and you say, does it look blue? If it doesn't look blue, you got a problem. Okay, don't fly the airplane. If it's got water in it, don't fly it. If it's got sediment, don't fly it. Okay, we're looking for blue. And then jet fuel is going to be colorless or kind of a straw color. Okay. For those who care, right? On the top of the wings, you're going to see it says we only use this kind of aircraft fuel. Okay. All right. Why can't we just use fuel from Wawa? Take a 5-gallon can from Wawa, carry it over to my plane, fill it up. It's a lot cheaper, right? The industry is moving towards the ability to use regular unleaded fuel in aircraft. Some aircraft are certified. You see the STC supplemental type certificate is really just an authorization from the FAA and the manufacturer that says, we have done all the testing, we've designed it, we've done the testing, we can make sure it's safe, and they can issue an STC and say, yeah, you can use regular fuel in your airplane. Okay, you're not going to see that in the aircraft we have here. Okay. All right, I talked about this already. This is all about why do we do it, right? We test it because we want to live to fly another day. Right? That's the way I like to put it. If you don't do it the right way and you don't do your due diligence on the fuel supply, it's going to end and not end well. Okay. Take every strainer, check for dirt, check for water, and keep draining it until it's clear. If it's not clear, don't fly. Okay. Yes, sir.
Is that image with water in the fuel?
Yes.
Okay.
Good point. Right. So here you can almost see that it's blue. And you'll notice it immediately. If you've got water in your tanks and you're draining from the sump, you're going to see the water is going to sink right to the bottom of that fuel tester. Right. It's going to be quite obvious. What can go wrong? What can go wrong? Now, as morbid as it may be, you're all from around here, relatively close anyway.
Right.
Who heard about the twin engine aircraft that crashed shortly after takeoff last summer?
Sam,
Who's Sam? Why?
he failed to do pre-flight,
And what
test the
happened?
fuel,
Been tested.
and he had contamination coming in from the fuel tank.
The airplane was sitting outside. They've just done a lot of maintenance and a lot of overhaul on it, just flown it back from Michigan. It was sitting outside. Sat outside in the weather. They didn't realize that those fuel caps on the top didn't have the right seals, right? Water got into the fuel, Sam, who was a very experienced pilot, was in a hurry
Get their
and
itis.
decided he didn't want to test the fuel that day. Cost him his life. A very simple test, couple minutes to do his pre-flight and test that fuel. Either scratched the flight or got the water out of the system and saved his own life. It's a really bad example, but it can happen. Right? I don't stress enough with my students, when you're doing a pre-flight, that is so important to do all of that stuff. The pre-flight isn't just a checklist, right? You're doing it because you're making sure that airplane is safe. As a pilot in command, you want to get in an airplane with your family? If you haven't done that pre-flight, no. No, nobody does.
It's usually a line of things. So Sam had get their itis
Huh?
and he's waiting for the refuel, and then he was putting the blame on the refueler to get there to fill up his tank. And he said, come on, because I have a flight to catch.
Yeah, he had to be in Nashville, I think it was, right?
Yep, to get the flight back because he was selling that plane.
Yep.
So, and then it sets you up for failure because then you're going to skip checks that are necessities.
That's, you're about 20 lessons ahead of the syllabus. But yeah, there's so many things, most of the accidents you're gonna see and read the accident reports are, it's not just one thing. It's a series of things that the pilot ignored that got them to where they were.
If you're flying in, you land somewhere to refuel, do you then check the fuel again?
Absolutely. Every time you refuel, I think the FAA's recommendation is every time you refuel and before the first flight of every day. Okay. Theoretically, if there's condensation, it's gonna happen overnight. Okay, so if somebody else is flying the airplane, they finish their lesson, you jump into it 20 minutes later. Unless it's been refueled, probably a pretty good chance that the fuel's gonna be okay if the last pilot did his job. But are you gonna trust that? No, as pilot in command, it's your responsibility to make sure that plane is ready for flight and safe. Okay, not the guy that flew it before you. Okay, so always do it. Any other questions? Yeah.
I know it's actually, okay, there's different colors, like the small color, like the blue, but if there, have you ever had any experience with somebody mixing the fuels? Because I know that might not be as obvious to be able to tell if there was a different fuel that was added, or does that not happen very frequently?
You mean somebody inadvertently put the wrong fuel in? Yeah, I've never heard of that. It's not that it couldn't happen. Not likely to happen here because we've got the fuel, and 100 LL. Right? So you're seeing the big truck pull up in front of your plane or the little truck. If the big truck pulls up in front of your little plane, that's a flag. Say, stop, don't put that in my airplane. Okay. But that it doesn't say it couldn't happen, right? I actually have a student. He has his own plane down in one of the hangars, and one day he was testing the fuel, and it was blue, but it was blue. We chose not to fly that day until he had the fuel tested, right, just to make sure, because it wasn't that normal kind of, I don't want to call it bright blue, but really differentiated from the white. Not the plane with the mud all over the wing, but if you hold that up to the white wing, it's a very distinct blue. All right, questions? How are we doing on time?
Good, about 20 minutes.
We might finish early tonight. I just jinxed it, didn't I? No. All right, normal combustion. You guys all learned this. Was it the last class? Intake, compression, power, exhaust, right? So what happens with normal combustion? It's a very smooth process that during that combustion cycle, right? During that compression of power, it's smooth. We have this thing called detonation. Okay? What happens with detonation is it's not smooth, right? It's a very uncontrolled explosion, right? Not normal, but what should be happening. That can lead to piston failure. It can lead to various problems with your engine. And a lot of that can be caused by using the wrong grade of fuel. Okay. We talked when I first mentioned the grades of fuel, right? If you're burning a low octane fuel in a high performance plane, it's burning too hot. right? You're gonna have that kind of detonation. You want the right kind of fuel because the manufacturer has manufactured that engine to be smooth running through that 4 strokes, right? To make sure they don't have that detonation. Okay. High cylinder head temperatures, I think we're gonna talk about cylinder head temperatures in a couple of slides. But if you start to see high cylinder head temperatures, meaning your engine's running hot, that's a good indication that you're going to encounter detonation, right? You need to get those engine cylinders cooled off a little bit. Okay, it's burning too hot. Okay, can get detonation if you're using too low fuel, high manifold pressures, high power settings with a lean mixture. Did you learn about mixtures? Okay, all right, fuel mixture. Yeah, so if you're running lean, what's that mean? Not enough fuel. And if there's not enough fuel, what tends to happen? Heats up. Heats up. Okay. Okay, this is another one. I don't necessarily worry about the extended ground operations. We don't sit on the ground too long around here. Steep climbs, right? If you're in a steep climb, what kind of power setting do you have when you're taking off? Full power, high power. It's gonna be burning hot, right? As you're in a climb, that's more and more heat being added to the engine because you don't have what to cool it off. Airflow, right? Right, you're at that climb speed, which is not cruise. You're much slower than a cruise speed, so that airflow over the engine isn't enough to keep it cool. So a lot of times you're going to see detonation could be caused because your engine's running hot, just because you're in a long climb and not keeping that engine cool.
Are any of the planes that we fly for trainers, they have the manifold pressure or they the control propeller or are they six?
They, you said a couple of things there. They're not FADEC. I know.
No, definitely not.
Yeah. All of the airplanes we have, the Cessnas and the Warriors that we use for primary training are all constant speed propellers, not manifold pressure, not variable speed,
Okay.
but constant speed. They're fixed pitch props.
Fixed pitch, yes.
Yep. And that's some of the stuff I'm gonna gloss over really quickly, because if you're taking your primary training, you're not gonna get into the constant speed propeller systems, right? You're more worried about the fixed pitch. Okay. All right. Again, detonation, how do we avoid it? Keep the fuel cowl flaps. None of the planes we have cowl flaps. But cowl flaps are used to increase or decrease the airflow around the engine. If it's too cold, you can close the flaps, keep the engine warm. If it's too hot, you can open them up, get that airflow over the engine. Okay. And use enriched fuel mixture, shallow climb angle for better cylinder cooling, we just talked about. Okay. If you're in a steep climb, you want to make sure that the mixture is rich. But if you leave it out in the climb, it's not going to lend to maintaining your cylinder head temperatures. Okay. All right. Let's see. Pre-ignition. So pre-ignition is the other bad thing, right? We've got detonation, we've got pre-ignition. Pre-ignition is just when in a normal cycle, right? The valve or the cylinder is coming up. The compression happens. You get that power stroke, right? Nice and smooth, right? And it goes down. In pre-ignition, the ignition with the spark plugs happens early, pretty nice, right? So when that cylinder or when that piston is on the upstroke, it's prematurely getting the power to push it back down. It can't go down yet, right? It's got to finish that cycle, right? That shaft is pushing it. So what happens is that pre-ignition puts unnecessary force or pressure on that piston and causes problems with either the pistons or the cylinder or the valves or the gaskets. Any part of that engine could be at risk as a result of that pre-ignition. Okay. Okay, this is saying the same thing. Definitely not something you want to get into. All right, fuel. We talked about fuel. Any questions on fuel systems? Pretty simple stuff, right?
Yeah.
A little bit more complex than cars, but still not bad.
So how can you get that recognition? What are their costs? That's something you mentioned.
That's just gonna be primary, one of the biggest causes of that is just spark plugs, right? You've got, faulty spark plugs or spark plugs that are gunk, right? They're just not, throwing the right signal for the right spark. Okay. And you'll know, right, if this is happening, it's not gonna sound right, it's not gonna feel right, it's gonna be rough, right? So, just. If your engine's not running rough for one reason or another, whether it's detonation, pre-ignition, good idea to have somebody look at it, right? Okay, oil. What's the primary purpose of oil in a car? And what? Lubrication and cooling. What's the primary purposes of oil in a plane? Lubrication and cooling, right? See, we just finished that part. We can skip through about 50 slides here. Okay. All right. Two different type of systems, wet sump, dry sump. Wet sump essentially just means that the oil is in the engine itself. A dry sump means you've got the engine. The oil is in a different location and it's pumped into the engine. Okay, circulated by pumps. Wet sump, you can see here, you got all the oils in here and it's circulated around the engine, but it resides in the engine itself. Okay. That's a cool picture, but it really doesn't. Okay. Oil pumps provide the pressure in a dry sump system. You got a pressure, a fuel pump or an oil pump. It's driving it from that dry sump or where it is into the engine, circulating it and sending it back out to the sump. Okay, pretty simple difference between wet sump, dry sump. Oil pressure gauges, just like you see in a car. Back in my day, they were analog. Now they're mostly digital, right? You get an oil pressure saying high fly oil pressure, low oil pressure. You're going to have a gauge in the aircraft. You're going to have numbers, and most likely it's going to have red, green, right? Maybe yellow. To indicate, are we high, oil pressure high, or is it where it needs to be? Okay. That last bullet point there says oil pressure indication should be present during engine start. Okay. What kind of oil pressure do we have when we first start the engine?
Low.
Zero, basically, right? You're not getting that oil pressure until the engine's cranking and it's circulating that oil and you're getting the oil pressure. So one of the first things you do, how many lessons do you have? 2? How many? Okay. What's the first thing you do after you start the engine? What's the first check on that checklist after the engine turns over? Check the oil pressure. Yep, exactly. Okay. In any normal, I'll call it any of the general aviation aircraft that we have, the expectation is that oil pressure indicator is going to be in the green in 15 to 30 seconds, right? So the first thing you want to do once you get the engine running, get the tachometer set, get the engine where you want it, look at that oil pressure gauge. Is my oil pressure coming up, right? If it's not, what can happen? Engine overheating, engine failure, right? So it's really critical that you make sure that that engine is, or that oil is circulating and you've got that oil pressure where it needs to be as soon as you can after the plane starts. Okay. All right, oil temperature. Just like any other oil temperature gauge in a car or anything else, it's got a green, got a red, you want to keep it in there. Now, again, if it's cold, it's going to take a little while to get that temperature up where it needs to be. What we kind of teach is if your oil temperature isn't within that green range before takeoff, don't take off, right? Make sure your oil temperature, not just your oil pressure, but your oil temperature is in that green range before you hit the runway. Okay. All right. After start, adjust to 1,000 RPMs. That's on the checklist. Immediately, you should see that oil pressure gauge go to green. Okay. All right. Decrease in oil pressure. What's a decrease in oil pressure kind of indicate? What could cause a decrease in oil pressure? Oil leak. What else? running out of it, right? Low oil. Okay, so what's one of the things on the pre-flight checklist? Check the oil. Okay, check the oil. Every manufacturer, every aircraft and every engine is gonna say, what's the minimum? Ours out here, if you go below 6 quarts of fuel, put a quart in it, right? Don't ever fly it below 6 quarts. Okay. Right. See that your oil temperature or your oil pressure gauge is going down, down, down in flight. Not much you can do other than get the plane on the ground, and get a look at it, right? Don't try to stretch it out and make it back to Chester County. Okay. Oil pressure with the tide, normally they have a relief, right? You're rarely gonna see high oil pressure because the system is gonna take, system is going to be built to avoid that. Make sure that we don't blow the seals, make sure that we don't have those other problems. Okay, your pressure is gonna increase as it heats up, that's okay. As long as it stays in that green zone. Right? High oil temperature, again, there could be something defective in the system, it's not circulating correctly. Again, if you're at a high steep climb rate, right? What's going to indicate, or what's your oil temperature indication going to be? It's like your cylinder head temperature. If you don't have that cooling, what's it going to do? It's going to get hot, right? You're going to see a high oil temperature reading, right? Again, lower the nose, continue your climb to get that circulation. Let the oil temperature and the cylinder head temperature come down. What's one of the purposes of the oil? To cool, right? So if the oil's not cool, it's not going to cool the engine. All right. We talked about this. If it's a cold day, it's going to take a while. Just be patient with it. She likes to be pampered. Okay. We already talked about this. 30 seconds is sufficient. If it's not getting, like they said, if the pressure is not getting where it needs to be, call it a day and have somebody look at it. Okay. One of the things that people will do, sometimes you will see it here, sometimes you'll see it in other planes. Either keep the plane in a hangar to keep it warm or preheat it. Have a system to preheat the engine, a blower, an engine block heater to heat it up before you start it. Okay. Insufficient oil, we already talked about it, can cause high temperatures, oil consumption, loss, right? The hotter it is, the more oil you're gonna burn. How often do you have to top off the oil in your car? Almost never, right? Let's be honest, who checks the oil in their car on a regular basis? Do you?
I have 86.
Well, okay. All right, that's the exception. So cars aren't designed, and car engines are not made to burn oil normally. Yeah, I used to drive an old Chevy Vega, 1972 Chevy Vega. That baby burned oil to the point where I had a case of oil sitting in the back of the car. Every time I stopped, I put one in. Planes are different. Plane engines are manufactured and they are made, I won't say they're made to burn oil. They're made to not burn oil like car engines are. So it's normal after several hours to have to put a quart of oil into a plane engine. That doesn't indicate a problem. Planes burn oil and you just need to keep track of it, right? That's why, again, it's so important during the pre-flight to check it. Okay. So you can go from above 6 quarts to below 6 quarts in an hour, in an hour flight. Okay, questions? Okay, nobody checks the oil in their car, right? Does everybody know how to check the oil in your car? Okay, same thing, right? Every plane's gonna have, looks like a big tube coming out of the engine with an oil dipstick.
So on that dipstick, where's the full?
The what?
I'm looking at that dipstick, I don't see any full line.
You can barely see
Oh,
it
it's at the
here.
top right there.
Yeah, they're really small indicators, little tick marks with a number. It'll be typically 4, 6, 8. And that's how you're looking at it. Yeah, yep, it's marked. The hardest part about checking the oil is, especially if the engine has just had an oil change, the engine or the oil is pretty clear, right? Sometimes you want the oil to be a little brown, but it's easy to see. A lot of times right after an oil change in a plane, you're not gonna see that. It's really hard to see where that break is and how full the oil is. Now,
So when you say an oil change in the plane, do you mean like actually taking the oil out?
Yep. 50 hours, every 50 hours of plate. Yeah, they do an oil change. Not only do they change it, they test it, they test the oil, and they're looking for sediment, they're looking for shavings, right? They have different tools they use and different standards they do to see, is the oil doing its job, or is the engine deteriorating?
So to your point, overfilling it, especially when you have new oil, can lead to problems too. And I actually did that. Where I couldn't see it and I was driving, and oh geez, I actually put oil in this, and I pulled out the dipstick and looked like there was nothing in there. So I started adding a quart,
Next thing you know, it's running out the top, right?
started smoking. Right?
Okay,
Because it's
you
getting
got too
blown
much.
by. Yeah,
too much.
exactly. So I shut it down. And luckily I drained enough out of it to get wasn't damaged. So it'd be difficult.
All right. Any questions on fuel or oil? How are we?
It's about, yeah, 7 o'clock right now, so that's.
You almost failed.
Yeah.
You almost failed. All right,
Until 7:03.
let's take 5 to 10. If you haven't signed in yet, please come up and sign your sheet before you head out, and then we'll take a break. Jacqueline, you're flying?
No.
You didn't start? Did you start? Did you take a couple of lessons last time with Kenzie?
No.
You never started? Okay.
No, that was Lexi.
Okay.
Lexi, she took a bunch, remember Lexi?
Yeah,
Yeah, she took a bunch.
Okay.
I heard she tore her ACL.
she did. Yeah, she just, she had the surgery in November.
Yeah.
She's back in the cockpit now. I think she got back in the cockpit right after the beginning of the year.
Yeah, Ella, and she drove her over to Brandywine.
What?
She said she flew her to her doctor's appointment.
Oh, really?
Her ACL, to have her surgery.
Why not?
done.
Yeah.
I know, yeah.
It's a 5-minute flight. Why would?
She said that it was like really close to where she was getting her surgery done.
Or not, just an excuse to fly an airplane.
Probably,
Yeah.
yeah.
How are we doing with the temperature? Feels a little warm in here to me. Can we turn down a little bit? It's so long. You feel anything coming out?
These are earrings.
In the slide, it says that you can get this from manifold and lower PM. How did you get it on that? This is my phone. A high manifold is associated with iron.
It should be.
Yeah.
So what they're saying there is you have a fixed,
I have an SR22.
Okay, so what they're saying is if you have high manifold pressure and you set it for a low RPM, you're putting more power to that propeller than you.
Yes.
Right, and then some call it prop over, right? You're pushing too much power to the prop, and that's when you're gonna get that prop. So when you. So, but you don't have a constant speed propeller, which
No.
SR22 should, right?
Yeah.
Oh, SR22's got a payback. So,
No, no.
but it's automatically adjusting your RPMs for, yes, that's the difference between a Cessna and a Piper and your Cirrus. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yours is designed and manufactured to avoid that situation.
Is Len Razzie gonna teach any classes?
He was supposed to teach too, and he had messed up his back or he messed up something, yeah, and in fact, he was supposed to be here Tuesday, and when Ella had to fill in, so Len was gonna be here. I don't know that he's on the schedule for anymore.
He was my instructor at West Cal.
Okay,
So
okay.
I was looking forward to seeing him.
Yeah, he may show up. Don't give up yet. Don't give up hope.
Sounds like being a pilot or instructor is hard on your body. Like ACL and
I don't know about that. Just getting old is hard on my body. Benefit to that Cessna is if you open that door and kind of step into it like a car. When you're climbing into that Piper, sometimes that can get tough. Getting in is hard, getting out is harder. Was that? I tried to fix that, but I didn't have access to that. That's a bad slide to stop on. We pilots are attention to detail. Yeah, I tried to fix it, but the big version I was working with a copy and we're gonna talk about engine tutorials here soon. There is a difference. Almost 8 years. I didn't start flying until I was 49. I was a late bloomer.
Do you fly all the aircraft out here or you?
I do not fly the Cirrus.
Okay.
I can't justify the expense of getting qualified in to fly it. I do all the Cirrus, all the Cessnas, all the Pipers.
So what did you do before age 49 when you started to fly?
Raise kids. Kids are money suckers, let me tell you. No, when I was 49, my wife got me a discovery flight for my 49th birthday. Never turned back. I went straight from private pilot to instrument rating to commercial pilot to CFI without stopping. It gets in your blood. It's in your blood. All right, we're still listening to, yeah, we'll listen to him. So how are we doing so far? Everything good? All right. I don't know. I didn't look ahead in the syllabus. Is this the last? Anybody else look ahead in the syllabus? What's
Next week's
What's
chapter 7 stuff.
that?
I think next week is chapter 7 stuff.
Next week, okay. So it's still more controls and engine stuff, okay. This stuff is, I don't want to say it's dry. It's a little bit more difficult to pick up if you're not mechanically inclined or haven't been exposed to it, but this is critical. When we talk about going from ground school to going to the airplane and ultimately going to that check ride, right? With the FAA, you got an FAA examiner sitting in the plane next to you. You're doing an oral exam and a flying exam, right? That examiner expects you, again, as the pilot in command, to be knowledgeable about your airplane, right? How does the fuel system work in your airplane? How does the electrical system work in your airplane? What are the hydraulic or electrical components, right? They expect you to know that, right? Because what happens in the air, you have an emergency, you need to be able to react, right? So this is what we talked about. I think most of you are in the room, right? There's a lot more to flying than just getting in the cockpit, turning over the magnetos and taxiing and taking off, right? The knowledge, the smart piece of it is a huge, huge part of being a pilot. You never stop learning, right? People make fun of me, especially my family. I still pull these books out. Every year, when the federal aviation regulations get republished with a new volume, I get the new one. My daughter now knows that's a Christmas present. So every year I get it, I read it. right? To keep myself fresh, to remember everything, and to make sure I'm staying current. Right? The pilot never stops learning, whether it's about the airplane, or about the industry, or about the regulator. Okay,
Question,
yes, sir.
when you take the check flight, are the questions you're being asked that open-ended, like tell me about your fuel system?
Oh, yeah. There's no limits. You can ask anything you want. Anything you want. So little hint. Somebody turn off the recording. Little hint, right? You're here for the ground school. Purpose of the ground school is to understand the knowledge. Right? So that you can prepare for the written test that the FAA gives to be able to move on to take your flying test. I won't say all. I will say, I'll put it this way. All of the FAA examiners that I know look at the grade on that written test. Did you get a 96? Did you get a 60? I think it's a 60 of passing, I think. 70. Did you get a 72? Or did you get something in the middle? A lot of examiners are going to look at your results on that written test and say, you did really good on that written test. And they're going to go easy on you in the oral portion because they know you've put the effort into it. If you start and they detect a ripple or a gap, they might drill into that, right? But most of them are going to give you the benefit of the doubt. If you eked by on that written test with a 72, they're going to grill you in that oral exam to make sure whatever you didn't know then, you know now. Make sense? Right? So all the more important to get this stuff, right? And get that good grade. I try to coach my students the same way, right? I will not endorse you to go do your written exam until you consistently show me that you've scored 90 or better on practice exams. Then I know you're going to do well, right? I'm not going to endorse you if you're consistently getting 74, 75, 80 on your written. That's kind of too close, right? Because you don't want to fail. All right, I'm off my soapbox. Okay. All right, we talked about this. We talked about engine cooling, right? The engine can overheat for many different many different reasons. What leads to power loss, leads to engine failure, leads to engine problems. Air cooling is common for, small airplanes, right? What's the purpose of oil? Cooling. And lubrication, right? Can only cool the engine so much, right? What's the other method we use to cool the airplane? Air circulation. Right? All the little things, I never wondered, I never knew what they were for, right? Why do we have all the little things on there?
More surface area.
More surface area. I love it. Love it. You're an engineer, scientist?
Software engineer.
There you go. Right? It's all about the surface area. The more surface area you have, the more air exposure, the more cooling, the better cooling you have. All right. We talked about cowling, right? So what we talk about here is, remember I talked about the cowl covers? Cowling covers? Some aircraft have these cowling covers you can open and close that adjust the amount of air flowing over the engine to keep it cool. Okay, cold days, close them up a little bit. Hot days, keep them open. Make sure you get the air circulation. Okay, and it's that simple. Air flows through, goes past the engine, out the other side. Okay, constant flow of air to keep it cool. I hope we're not flying the airplane that way. Trust me. Okay, they're showing all the fins. And then showing the cowling covers or the cowling, right? Every airplane's going to have that cowling in the front. That's where the airflow is coming through. All right, we talked about this earlier too. High speed, high power settings, low airspeed. What are we running the risk of? Overheating, right? Because we don't have that flow. We're operating at high power settings with not enough airflow because we're at low speeds. We want to make sure we try to avoid those situations. Situations where you can't avoid it, like in a steep climb, right? High power settings, low speed. What do we do to help us assist?
Nose down.
Nose down, right? So if you're in an extended climb, just lower the nose, let the airflow cool the engine down, and then continue your climb. Okay, get that airflow, let the air do its job. All right, gauges to avoid high temperature. We already talked about the oil temperature gauges, and oil pressure gauges. Monitor that stuff. Your airplane is gonna have, most airplanes are gonna have some kind of cylinder head, temperature gauges. Monitor that, right? We always tell everybody you're flying VFR, where should you be looking? Look outside the airplane, right? You're looking out there. And then you're scanning your instruments, right? You're coming back in, spending a couple of seconds, look at everything, develop that good scan, make sure you're where you need to be on airspeed, make sure you're where you need to be on power setting, look at your fuel gauges, look at your pressure gauges, right? Always keep monitoring those gauges. Excessive cooling, just like excessive heating can cause problems in an airplane, it's bad to what we call shock cool an engine. If that engine is hot and all of a sudden is exposed to rapid cooling, that's not good for the components of the engine either. They would call that super cooling or shock cooling, and it can cause problems as well. So when you're doing a steep descent, again, good idea to keep an eye on your gauges. Make sure you're not overcooling. Some aircraft will have in their pressure and temperature monitor gauges, it'll have a light that flashes or some indication that says you're shock cooling. You're getting cooled too fast, right? Slow it down a little bit. Okay, so hot is bad. Cooling too quickly is not good either. Okay. Here's just a couple of different types of indicators for that engine heat or engine temperature. Okay. Green is good. Red, not so good. Okay. To avoid the excessive heat, increase the mixture. Okay. Get more airflow. We already talked about the cowling covers. Any questions there? Yes, ma'am.
It's not about the cow, it's about the gauges.
Yeah.
Why do some of them have white, like the?
That's just the normal. That's showing it's in the normal range, right? So what you would see there is as they get hotter and hotter, if they're getting to they're digital, right? So if they get to a point where it's getting too hot, they're going to turn yellow or they're going to turn red as they get higher.
The one like right behind your head there. Like
Yeah,
after
cylinder
the-
head.
I got a big head. Yeah.
It's. Is that the same thing or?
It usually means once you pass the red, you're screwed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't go past it. Yep, stay in the green. All right. Any other questions before I move on? We good so far? Okay. This is what I talked about preheating. I think there's different ways to preheat it. It's like if you have if you're from Buffalo, and you got to go out and put an engine block heater in your car to keep it warm to start up. Anybody ever live in a place like that? Good Lord, we just had it here for 2 days. I'm done.
You just everybody lived there. I grew up in Burlington, Vermont.
Are you glad you moved?
No, I'm actually getting my pilot's license so I can fly back to Vermont instead of driving the 8 hours.
Oh, good. Yeah, good. All right, so preheat the engine. That it just enables easier start, making sure, again, you've got a better maintained engine, not overheating it quickly. Okay. Propellers, we already talked about propellers, right? You learned about propellers in the last couple of classes somewhere along the way. Okay. Generate thrust, induce drag stalls, all the same aerodynamic principles as a regular airfoil. Okay. I'm gonna skip this, yeah, got it again. Okay. All right. Simple, not simple. Mechanics, right? Physics and mechanics. What happens, how in relative speed, what happens to this part of the propeller blade? Move faster or slower? Moves fast. Okay. So the further you get from the shaft, the faster the propeller spin. Right? In order to maintain the same level of lift throughout the span of the propeller, what would we have to do? What do we have to change? Change the pitch. change the pitch of that propeller, change the twist, right? So in order to, with a fixed pitch propeller, they're designed in such a way to maximize or make it the most efficient, normally for cruise flight. So the propeller is designed to maintain efficiency or maximum efficiency in cruise. And it's looking at how is the blade designed to have the right angle, okay, across the length of that blade. The further you get out, okay, the faster it goes, so the less angle it needs to be. Okay, make sense?
Is the tip on the blade, if it's red, is that adding weight to it? Or what is the purpose of the color on the end of the tips?
Don't walk into me.
That's what it is? Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, you walk into a spinning prop, it's gonna put a dent in your health record, right?
Yeah, it's happened to people, yeah.
Anytime you see a color, it's just aesthetic. Nope. Okay. How are we on time?
7:20.
We're gonna finish plenty early, because these are where I'm gonna start getting into. Let's just touch this very quickly, because a lot of what we're gonna cover now is getting into constant speed propellers, which you're not gonna see in these aircraft, right? If I teach you now, not likely you're gonna see questions on the FAA exam related to a constant speed propeller. You need to know it when you start flying one. If I teach it now, by the time you start flying one, you're gonna completely forget it. Well, no, I'm not that bad of an instructor. You would remember everything by the time I started constant speed propeller. I didn't set myself up that well. Fixed pitch propellers, this is the ones we just talked about, right? Fixed pitch propeller, designed to be, have maximum efficiency primarily in cruise flight, right? They're easy to maintain, they're more cost efficient than a variable pitch constant speed propeller. Okay, so basically we were saying the propeller RPM is the same as the engine RPM, right? The propeller is mounted on the crankshaft, right? So the faster that crankshaft and that engine is turning, the faster the propeller is turning. So when you're advancing your throttle, propeller's speeding up, pulling back in the throttle, propeller's slowing down. Okay, all just one gear. Okay. Tachometer is just what you're looking at. It's indication of the power in the engine and telling you how many RPMs you're getting on that propeller. Okay, again, you want to stay in the green, primarily cruise flight. Most of the aircraft we have out here, whether it's a Cessna or a Piper, cruise speed, you're going to be right around 2,300 RPMs. That's normal. Okay, right in the middle of the green area. Okay. Questions on RPMs? Fixed pitch propellers are the easiest ones. You can't do anything. Increase the RPMs on the throttle, propeller goes faster. Okay. You should have had this. Well, what's the purpose of the throttle? What's the throttle do? Increases what?
RPM.
It does, but what does it increase really? Not just air. Fuel air mixture, right. It increases the amount of fuel air mixture, which creates more power, makes the engine go faster, increases the RPMs, right? So the throttle is controlling the fuel air mixture or the fuel air flow. Okay. Right. At a given altitude, the higher the tachometer reading, the higher power out of the G engine. Makes sense, right? So if we're at sea level, the more we advance the throttle, the more we get more power we get out of it. The point they're trying to make here, as altitude increases, what happens to the density of the air? Do you guys have that already? Okay. Density decreases, right? Which means what? With every turn, every spin of the blade, what do you get? You get less power, less thrust, right? Because the propeller doesn't have as much air to cut through, right? So you lose not only RPMs because of the pressure out or the density altitude change, right? The engine loses efficiency at higher altitudes. That leads to less propeller efficiency and less propeller thrust. Okay, so if you set your if you set your throttle and your RPMs at 2,300 and cruise flight at 2,500 feet altitude and climb to 7,000, you're going to see, without adjusting the throttle, you're going to see the power decrease in the output of the engine. Make sense? Just because of the density of the air at a higher altitude. Okay, so the more you climb, the more you have to advance the throttle to maintain that same power output. Nobody's got a deer in headlights look? Everybody got that? Okay, all right.
And less oxygen into the engine,
What's that?
less O2 into the engine.
Yep, exactly. All right, this is what we just talked about, right? Less horsepower at a higher altitude. Constant speed propellers. Difference with a constant speed propeller is you can set the RPMs, right? You set the RPMs that you want in a propeller, and the system will maintain that RPM regardless of where you put that throttle. Okay? It's built so that if you set the RPMs for 2,300 RPMs on the propeller and increase the throttle, you're not going to see the RPMs getting any faster. Okay, we'll get into that in a minute. This is where we talk about manifold pressure. Don't know over there was talking about manifold pressure. Manifold pressure versus just throttle and RPMs, RPM settings, tachometer. Okay. Constant speed propeller aircraft, two controls, the throttle and the propeller control. Okay, all of those ones that have a fixed pitch propeller got this big thing here, the big throttle control. They don't have the fancy blue knob. Okay. So in a constant speed propeller, you're setting your RPMs with this one. This is where you're saying, how fast do I want that propeller to spin? Okay. This is still in the airplane. The throttle still exists to control that fuel air volume and flow, right? So it increases the pressure, increases power, but that increase in power will not lead to an increase in RPMs. Okay, so they're independent to a point. If you're at a low power setting, like if you're sitting out here in idle, then it matches, right? So if you do increase the RPMs, or the throttle will increase the RPMs. But in flight, the blue knob is going to control how fast your propeller goes. Okay, and the black handle is going to increase the power.
Which position would it be if you feathered your prop?
Feathering the prop is all the way back.
All the way back.
All the way back.
All the way decrease.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, so when you're full prop, okay, intuitively, full prop is full power, full RPMs. Okay, what does high RPMs mean? What's that?
Power.
It's not power. Again, we're talking, just think about a constant speed propeller. When we're talking about this knob being forward, if you're advancing that knob, right, to increase the propeller speed, it's going faster. Okay, what does that mean when it comes to what's controlling that speed? The pitch, right? So as you're advancing that to get higher RPMs, what do you think is happening to the pitch?
Less bite.
Less bite, less pitch, right? So the propeller is going faster, partially because there's less resistance. You're not taking as big a bite. As you pull that knob back, it's giving you more pitch, okay? Which means you're taking a bigger bite of air, which means it's inherently going to give you more thrust, but less speed.
And the
Makes
engine
sense?
will work harder.
The engine's working hard.
Is that the whole prop is tilting a direction, or what is actually changing?
So that's a fixed pitch problem.
Yeah.
So what happens is when you look at a constant speed propeller, and we'll see pictures of it, but there's a joint.
Okay, so that is.
So it's the actual prop itself where the blade is turning, right? The pitch of that blade is turning. So this is not connected like it is here. Okay, and it's hydraulics and governors that are controlling that pitch. It's depending how you set that prop control. Okay, there's gonna be a picture in here. All right, makes sense? So the throttle is for the power. And the prop speed is for the RPMs, how fast you want that prop to be going. And it's all about efficiency, right? So when you're in takeoff mode or in landing mode, you want maximum flight. You want maximum lift out of that prop, right? So you've got it at full power. When you're in cruise, you want to dial it back a little bit, right? Bring it back to a point where you're not over speeding the propeller, not going too fast. And you just got it where you want. As you increase power, as you increase altitude or decrease altitude, your prop speed is going to stay right where it is. I'm getting way too much detail here.
So,
This is what I didn't want to do.
so there's no specific control to change the pitch of the prop. It happens automatically based on the RPMs. Is that correct?
Yes, you set the RPMs and the system, the hydraulics and the governors and everything back in the back, behind the black curtain is what will adjust the pitch of that blade to maintain that prop speed. I'm sorry? Right, the student that I have had a Piper P28, Cherokee, Piper Cherokee. We've got a Piper Cherokee that sits in the line, pretty blue and white airplane owned by one of the DPEs. That's constant speed. The Cirruses that we have are constant speed propellers. A little bit different design than this, what we were talking about earlier. He doesn't have two controls. But almost all of our primary training aircraft are all fixed pitch props. But there are a lot of airplanes that have constant speed propeller.
I was thinking the other way, the ones that weren't fixed.
Constant speed.
Yeah.
Those fixed pitch.
Yeah.
And there's variable pitch / constant speed.
Yeah.
Your question is what?
So they're speed ones that are like, be any of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a crap ton of aircraft that have that setup. Right? But most of your primary trainers are going to be fixed pitch.
So with the constant speed, when you add more, well, decrease the RPM, you're adding more load to the engine, which would decrease the RPM gauge. Right? So you're kind of playing this game between the throttle and the constant speed.
No. When they're independent.
Yep.
Right? So when you set the prop speed, the governor and the system is going to maintain whatever you set that at. You can adjust the throttle and add more power. That's not going to increase the RPMs. You will get more power out of the airplane,
Gotcha.
but you're not going to increase the RPMs.
Okay,
Right.
so the RPM gauge is really indicative and mapped to the constant speed.
That's correct.
Propeller.
Propeller, that's right.
Thanks.
That's right. Yep. Okay, all right. We talked about the governor maintains it. Increase or decrease the angle, we talked about that. Let's see. Yeah, here's just a graphic of the governor and how it works. It's hydraulics, it's governors and hydraulics that are saying, hey, I set you here, and that oil pressure is sensing the differences and maintaining based on linkages and everything else is saying, hey, if my prop speed starts to slow down, I'm going to move and make sure it goes back to what I had it set at. If it starts to speed up, I'm going to go back the other way and change the angle of the pitch to make sure it maintains that speed, right? So the airplane is constantly managing that pitch of the propeller to maintain that constant airspeed or the constant prop speed. Okay. All right, we talked about that. Okay, control forward reduces pitch, high RPMs. Constant speed propeller, there's like 20 slides with this picture on it. We're not going to get into this much. Let's see. The one thing I want to indicate here, right? So we have an airplane with this configuration, right? We talked about the airplanes with a fixed pitch propeller. They've got an RPM gauge, just a tachometer, right? When you get into this configuration, you have the RPM gauge, you got the tachometer and manifold pressure. This is measuring the blue knob, right? You're setting the RPM where you want based on the blue knob. And the manifold pressure that fuel air volume adjustment with the throttle is what you're managing manifold pressure. Okay. Not gonna go through, not gonna, as my colleagues in the UK like to say, I'm not gonna drain the slide. But what's happening is the manifold pressure gauge is measuring the pressure of that fuel air mixture flowing over the venturi into the engine manifold, right? So it's measuring the pressure of the air volume, air fuel mixture. Okay. As you increase power, what's that going to do to the pressure? You're increasing pressure, right? So it's measuring that pressure that you're applying with that throttle. Okay. If that's measuring the pressure across the manifold and you're at a higher altitude, what's going to happen to that pressure reading? If you don't adjust the throttle, it's going to drop. Again, you're at a higher altitude, less density in the air, right? So just by nature, you're going to get a decrease in that pressure. In order to maintain that 2,700 or that 27 inches of manifold pressure, you're going to have to increase the throttle at a higher altitude, decrease it at a lower altitude.
So would a decent analogy for this would be like if you're riding a bike, the tachometer would be switching gears. And then the manifold pressure gauge would be how hard you're spinning the pedals. I don't know. So like
Equating what? You're equating the gears.
the RPM for the propeller is like the gears. So like if you, or not, so if you have the blades with a lot of bite, it's like being a lower gear, right? And then the less bite they have. the less-
Let's just say the gears
Sure.
are the equivalent of your RPM. Right? I want the gears set in 10th gear. God bless you, got some strong thighs, right? If that's your prop setting, your manifold pressure is how hard do you want to pedal to maintain that? It's not a great analogy, but if you pedal lighter in 10th gear, you're not going to go as fast. You're not going to get the same power because you're not pedaling as fast. But you have the same gears. Not a great analogy because the gears are still going slower if you're not pedaling as fast. The difference is with that blue knob, you're saying, I want the prop to spin that speed, and it's going to spin that speed, no matter how fast you're pedaling. Okay.
And troubleshooting your engine sort of changes. So with a fixed prop engine, you're looking at your RPM gauge for roughness of the engine. You see that tack bouncing around in roughness. In this, in the constant speed is mapped, the propeller is mapped to the RPM, so you have to use your manifold pressure to see if there's any.
You're going to get fluctuations in the pressure. Right. And like I said, at a lower speed, like if you're sitting on the tarmac, you're taxiing, you're idling, and even if you're doing a run up, right? I said very quickly, I said earlier, these two are independent to a point, right? At low altitude, low speed, when you're at a low speed idling out here, if you adjust the manifold pressure, you're going to see an increase in the prop speed, right? It's not until you get up to higher power settings where it becomes independent. Okay? There's certain low power settings where it doesn't matter how high you have your prop speed. If you exceed a certain level of a lower limit of prop or thrust or power, your prop speed is going to reduce. Right? The governor can only do so much, okay, to maintain that prop speed. Okay. We talked about manifold pressure. Talk about ambient air. We talked about higher altitude. Your manifold pressure will automatically or will just naturally decrease unless you increase the throttle, right? So because it's measuring the power or the pressure across the manifold, what's it going to read when you're sitting on the ground and the engine's off?
2992.
What? You're close, Whatever the pressure is
Pressure is-
outside, whatever the air pressure is outside is what's gonna read at that measurement, right? It's just static pressure, like you're sitting on the ground. The barometric pressure outside is 29.92 inches of mercury, it's gonna read that. It's not gonna change until you start the engine and get the throttle sending that fuel air mixture through the manifold to get that to move to something that is not ambient pressure. Okay? Yes,
So does manifold pressure and the numbers change such as for a turbocharged engine? Because let's see. On a car, you're basically negative, it runs negative on the,
I'd be lying to you if I tried to answer that. question.
yeah, the turbo is actually positive.
Turbocharge is not something I'm an expert on. I'm not gonna lie to you. You got me. Okay. All right, let's see, we talked about that. Yeah, as you increase the throttle, more for air is gonna drive manifold pressure. Again, this is all stuff that you're not gonna encounter in your primary training. I don't wanna drill into all of these slides. Manufacturer is gonna say, hey, if you're at cruise altitude, here's where you should set your pressure, manifold pressure, and here's where you should set your prop speed for maximum efficiency, right? So it's not just a matter of you're in cruise with a fixed pitch propeller, set it for 2,300 RPMs and cruise, right? Depending on altitude, the manufacturer is gonna say, hey, in order for maximum efficiency at cruise, you just set it for this manifold pressure or this prop RPMs. Right, so we talked about all that stuff. This is one thing that I think that you were referring to in some of in your question earlier, right? When we talk about, I'm just gonna skip all the slides and come to this one. When we talk about a constant speed propeller, again, you've got two controls, one for throttle, one for prop speed. They call it, I think he's got a slide in here called the prop on top. You change the slides. Look at that. Okay, so if you want to increase power and increase prop speed, they always say that the moniker is prop on top, right? If you want to go faster and increase prop speed, increase the prop, increase the blue knob first, and then increase your manifold pressure. Okay, if you want to slow down, decrease your RPMs, decrease the manifold pressure first, and then decrease the prop, right? So the prop is always higher. Different lines of thought, depending on who you talk to, what you read. The theory is if you have a low prop speed, your blue knob is back, and you advance the manifold pressure because overspeeding of the propeller, applying too much pressure to the propeller system and exceeding its capacity, right? And causing a problem with the propeller. So they say, keep the prop up first, and then manifold pressure, release the manifold pressure, then bring the prop down. Okay, it avoids that overspeed. Some people will argue in these training aircraft, that's not a huge issue, right? If you're in a smaller Piper that's got a constant speed propeller, you're not gonna cause that much damage, or you're not gonna cause damage to the system and the propeller with an overspeed situation. Again, lots of lines of thought, lots of different arguments, but if you're gonna do it, advance the prop first and reduce the manifold pressure first. Okay. All right, way more than everybody wanted to know about constant speed propellers, right? Okay, it's all good. It's all in there. Nicholas did a really great job. And Nicholas did a really great job of explaining in detail how the constant speed propeller works. I would encourage you to read it. If you have questions, let me know. We can talk about it. Give me a call, send me an email, meet me here. But it's something, like I said, it's not something you're going to encounter on day one or day two. Just be advised, or just be informed that it is different. It does exist. As you advance in your training, you'll encounter a system like that where you need to know it. Okay. He's got this one in here. I think this was from last class.
Yeah.
Okay. falling oil pressure, rising temperature. What does that mean? It says A. Who says B? Who says C? Okay. All right, questions? How'd we do? Good. All right, all make sense? All right, if no questions, thank you for coming. I will see you all in a couple of weeks. I'll be back. I hope that doesn't scare you away. Thank you. If you did not sign in, please do so. Otherwise, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.